Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to have a really exciting video because this is one that I get asked all the time, and it's regarding my settings on Apex Legends. What we're going to do is I'm going to go through my settings, then I'm going to describe the best settings and things that you can change variably throughout your config and setup. This is going to be a pretty easy video. I'm literally going to go through settings as if you were just sitting in the room with me, and we're going to go through each setting one at a time and really talk through everything. I'll even go through my keybinds. I'll do that later in the video because I know the most important thing that everyone is looking at is what affects your UI, what's going to be best, what's not going to be best, and some of it's a little bit subjective, which is okay, but let's just dive right into it. Obviously, you want to go to settings first, and we're going to start with video settings and what is actually important here. I recommend turning this all the way down to low. Now, first off, let me go and explain right off the rip that it's very, very important, especially in a BR when you're trying to look for as much survivability as possible, is that you go for as much frame rate and little to anything that's going to obstruct your view when gaming. This is why a lot of this stuff is turned down on low. While it can look very, very pretty, you are playing a battle royale and you want to survive, and survival is key. So obviously ragdolls you want all the way on low. This can reduce CPU load, especially if you have a processor that may not be very strong. If you happen to be streaming on a CPU, which at this point you probably wouldn't be doing so, this is going to be minimal, but nonetheless you want this on low. Impact marks, this is what's going to be marks whenever you shoot on a wall or something along those lines, so you have this on. If you're shooting your gun, you go over to the wall. This is good if you're testing recoil patterns like I've done in my prior videos. If you want to turn this on, maybe shoot at a wall and see the spray pattern, turn this up so you can actually see them. Otherwise, in-game, you don't really need to see the bullets on the wall. There's no reason to have it. It's only going to be a benefit to save you more frame rate. Now, the effects details. I recommend this also on very low. As you turn it up, you get more of those pretties from like explosions, things of that nature, but you don't really need this. All it's really going to do is really obstruct your view, and it's going to be harder to see things. Now, model detail, I have this on low. Obviously, if you have it on high, you know, you see the model detail of the character starts to raise. It looks a lot higher quality. Realistically, the difference is pretty minimal. I'm going to be honest. I'm going to show you another setting that actually has the biggest impact overall. Now, all these can be tied together. You really don't want dynamic spot shadows. Just not really much of a benefit there. It is a pretty hefty cost on your CPU and GPU. What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn everything up, and then I'm going to turn everything back to the lower settings so you can kind of see the difference between the two. I'll throw a grenade, kind of compare the differences, but what you're going to see is just a much cleaner UI and experience. And right now, obviously my FPS is at 240 when you're in game, especially whenever you're around the area of World's Edge. It can get really cluttered with this type of effects, especially with the lighting. You want this off. This is going to save you on the GPU load. Spot shadow detail. Shadows are very cost heavy, and if somebody's ratting or hiding, you want to be able to see it, so you really don't want these settings up. Obviously you can go high, very high, but they get very, very expensive. So I'll turn all of them off, and keep in mind the test environment can be very, very light in terms of frame rate and what details are actually in the air. So be mindful of that. Don't be fooled by what's actually happening in the test range, because once you're in the actual game itself, there's a lot more going on in terms of lighting, stuff that's around you, and especially when you're in a firefight and you start shooting your gun, and the effects that do occur, especially on the weapons that have effects that pop off when you get a kill, can be very impactful. So just be mindful of that. You're going to want the ambient occlusion quality disabled as well. This is very, very intensive on your GPU, even on a very high-end rig. Texture filtering. I have it trilinear. I kind of want it to look nice, but the difference is honestly very minimal as you start to look at the ground and then turn it up. I'm going to show you the main setting that is really going to save you the most frame rate, so you kind of see a difference. It's, again, it's minimal when you turn everything on and off. I'm going to show you that in a minute. Leave it at trilinear. Now, the biggest thing that makes a big difference is the texture streaming budget. Now, most people, you'll probably see streams. Let's put it very low. I want to turn it all the way off. When you look at bins, things of that nature, stuff will start to render in a little bit differently, or won't render in completely. And when you have it all the way off, it starts to make objects appear differently. Let me go ahead and turn it off, because I know a lot of streamers tend to turn it off. See how everything starts to look very, what's the word? Flat, pixelated. It's a lot more dramatic on this. But when you want your FPS to be as high as humanly possible, and you don't want things to kind of impact your frame rate, this is going to be the best setting to do it. It's most noticeable when you're opening up bins and you start seeing things at distance, and you're really just trying to hit somebody and see a target. Great example right here. Now, even just turning this on makes an impact. And even as you start to turn it up and you go, let's say, insane, the quality really starts to rise and start to look really, really sharp overall. I put mine, I think I had it around medium. Yeah. Which isn't bad. It kind of keeps it from looking completely Papega, where it's just overwhelmingly bad and just doesn't look like anything. So on stream, usually I get people come by and say it doesn't look awful. I mean, realistically, I probably should turn it all the way off just to maximize and more frame rate. But I don't mind it looking just a little bit pretty for people who stop by the stream, so it doesn't look like this. There you go, like that. And this is where you see a lot of streamers do. I probably should be doing the same thing, so I'm gonna step away from this setting. But understand, this is what's gonna save you the most frame rate. Okay, like if your PC is struggling, this is gonna be the biggest impact of, because it just impacts the overall textures that you want to utilize to save frame rate. So if you don't have a very strong rig, turn this all the way off or very low, and you're gonna save yourself massive amounts of FPS. Now, Vsync, I recommend turning off. This adds latency. If you have G-Sync, this is a lot better, but I don't recommend using Vsync, especially in a first-person shooter. Not very much of a benefit. So these are my settings. I did mention how I was going to cover all of them at the very end, but obviously you kind of already see my settings already. Very straightforward. At least you understand what everything does for the most part. These are going to be the biggest things in the environment that you're really looking at that have the biggest impact. Everything else you really just want off. I don't really... let's go and turn everything up for you just so you kind of see, not Vsync, because you will never have that on. Anti-Aliasing. Before I forget. My apologies. Now, the TSAA. I recommend turning this off. This can really kind of blur an image, in my opinion. I've never been a big fan of anti-aliasing, but if you don't like jaggies, then of course you can turn this off. But as you can tell, it's probably a little bit difficult to see, but nonetheless, it kind of blurs the image a little bit because it's just trying to smooth out everything, and I don't really like the way it looks blurry. I prefer turning it off. So when I'm shooting at, as you can tell, it looks a little sharper. It makes things in the environment pop a bit more, so I know what I'm shooting at. So if I turn that back on, see how it just blurs? It's great when you're trying to get a nice photo and make everything look really nice and pretty. And I don't see a lot of people turning this off, but when you turn it off, something from a distance, you see how that looks blurred right there? I'm going to turn anti-aliasing off, and it pops more instantly. Like this is noticeable in terms of if you're trying to hit a shot. It may not look as pretty in the environment, but it's definitely easier to shoot. And that's the goal of this overall tutorial and guide, is that you want it to be easier to shoot. Because when it's blurred, it almost looks like there's a depth of field, but it's not. Just keep in mind with anti-aliasing, it's just removing or, you know, changing the jaggies is what they usually call it. So now I'm going to turn everything on high. I'm going to turn off anti-aliasing because I think that really impacts the image. And I'm going to go back to my overall settings, and then I'm going to cover afterwards keybinds and gameplay. There's a lot of... Actually, I'm going to go to gameplay next because that's most relevant for people. I know some people could care less what my overall keybinds, mouse sensitivity is in this game at the current moment. I'm going to go to gameplay and discuss that in a moment. So let's enable everything on high. And also, before I forget, I apologize, field of view, I did a whole tutorial on that. Check that out on my channel. Turn this to minimal. You don't really want the screen shaking while you're running. I dislike it. Hey, if you like it, you like it. So when everything is on pretty much maxed out, you kind of have this... It's harder. You really have to go in game to really see the impact and difference. Where you'll notice the biggest frame rate difference is go into World's Edge around the fire area in the center of the map. So the part that I'm referring to is... Well, the part that I'm referring to is fragment. So go over to fragment. If you're fine over around fragment, then you can probably gauge that your settings are going to be okay because you'll get higher frame rate elsewhere. But nonetheless, you want as stable as performance around fragment because it really sucks fighting around fragment. And then you start getting performance hitches, so avoid that. Now if you turn on anti-aliasing at this point, TSAA, I hate the way it looks, but maybe it might be your bag. It's up to you. This is a personal preference thing. I've already shown you the difference that it can make at a distance, and hopefully better explains everything. Now I'm going to go back to my settings. Notice how even whenever I drop things down to low and disabled, it really doesn't make that much of a difference in the overall quality of the game because you're really focused on just surviving. I'm going to apply that. See, it's pretty minimal. Again, you'll notice the biggest difference from explosions. I'm going to go and throw a grenade, show you the difference.
Tossing a grenade.
Okay, I'll turn that. Let's look at the same grenade with higher textures with just everything. I'll leave TAA off because I just had it off, so I want to stay consistent, relatively consistent, right?
Throwing a grenade.
See? It's a little different. I mean, you could argue that the textures look a little sharper, so it's easier to see somebody. I'll throw it again, just so you have a nice comparison. You can pause the video, go back and forth. I personally get distracted, but just how prettier things start to look, so I don't really like it. I'll do the same for a thermite. Not to waste anybody's time. So it's debatable what you prefer. You throw a thermite. See it burn. Put all those graphics up to high, and then we're going to get into gameplay. The gameplay setting. And then I'll talk about my own sensitivity. So this might be a longer video, but I hope it's educational for you and you kind of figure out what settings you want.
Tossing thermite.
I don't know, some of it makes me rethink some of my settings, but at the same time, when you're in a gunfight and every bit of FPS dip that you get, you don't really want to have to deal with it, especially whenever it starts happening on your screen. So I'm going to go back to my own personal settings. I'll have you make your own informed decision based on what you see. I think I forgot to turn that up, which should be okay. I know there might have been a slight discrepancy there. Nonetheless, kind of gets to the point, right? Okay, let's get into gameplay settings next. There's a lot that can be changed here in terms of helping your overall visual UI. Now, the difference here in terms of stuff that you see how large this is, especially whenever you're trying to see more. I recommend turning this to compact. See, much easier to see, not overloading your whole UI. As you start to understand what stuff is, you don't need to be reminded for a full bar of text explaining what something is on screen. Hide button hints. As you get better at the game, just turn this off. Do yourself a favor. You don't need to be reminded hints mid-game. Now, this is a pretty big one, obviously, when you're shooting. Right? It either gives you the X or it doesn't. The shield icon and everything. It's been debated that if you have it off, I had just recently turned it off again. See how you don't get that giant X? Let me show you. Once you get the kill. See, it's not there. Some people get distracted by this giant X that appears on screen. Some people don't. So I kind of leave it up to you whether or not you want to leave that X that appears whenever you are hitting a target or shooting one. It is a little delayed. So if I turn it back on and I move my cursor around really, really quick, see how it still appears on screen? That can kind of throw you off, especially if you're hitting a target and you're shooting in the smoke and you're thinking that they're still there because it's still lingering, or whether or not you're just going based off of the actual damage. I'm going to turn it off again. I know a lot of people have it on. I'm going to leave it off. Now, you have a lot of options here in terms of damage. I recommend leaving it to, you can have both stacking, floating, or off. These damage numbers can be pretty impactful. Let me grab a flatline, kind of show you the difference here so you have a better understanding. So turning them off can obviously help you because it cleans up what you're looking at, right? I like to have the damage numbers on to stacking because I need to call out how much damage I did. And I need to know in the... Well, my server just shut down. That's fine. Let me get back in there. So let's get right back into it. So you can have stacking, floating. Now, the reason I don't do this setting is, as you can tell, the numbers just get overwhelming, and unless you're like a mathematician, you can add up all those numbers and figure out how much damage you did. Awesome too, especially whenever you're shooting a charge rifle. It's the most overwhelming. You just see a bunch of numbers flying everywhere. I don't recommend that. You can do both. That's just visually overwhelming as well. I don't recommend it. The cleanest one overall is just do stacking. Now, ping, I recommend keeping this to faded so you can see just through things. It just kind of helps with transparency. Turn on obituaries. This shows player kills and deaths. This is important mid-game so you know who is dying on the kill feed. Maybe you need a third party waiting for that knock. Maybe you're, trying to avoid a certain fight. This is good information. You can have your mini-map rotate. This is a personal preference. I don't have a mini-map right now, but nonetheless, if that's your bag, you can change that. Weapon auto cycles on empty. This is personal preference as well. You can decide once your mag empties that it automatically switches to your secondary. This is really up to you whether or not you want this. Honestly, now looking at this, I'm going to try this off and mess with it. You can auto sprint. This is also personal preference. I had mine off for a really long time, and I just turned it on recently to kind of play with it for this settings video to kind of give some insight on it. Overall, I don't know, leave it on. It's much cleaner that way. Double tap sprint. I'm probably not going to use that, to be honest. I mean, if this is your own personal preference, sure, why not? Incoming damage feedback. I guess this would be... This is one setting I'm probably actually haven't messed with. Type of arrow display when taking damage. I guess I need somebody to shoot me, but nonetheless, I guess it's important to know where you're getting shot from. I would probably just leave this on. Taking damage, closes death box menu, off. 100% off on this. If you're trying to hot swap to an armor or something. Now, if you're not really good at hot swapping armors, I definitely recommend practicing it. It's whenever, you know, obviously a box dies and you're doing your little crouch spam. If you're on PC, on controller, you get to stand still, unfortunately. You press F, you press A, whatever opens the box, depending on your platform. You open it up, and then you switch armors. Now, if you get shot, it closes it immediately. So you essentially want this to be off. So then you can continue looting or grab what you need really quick and then move. So if you've got a box out in the open, you want to grab that Kraber or something like that, and you don't want it to keep closing, well, turn this off. Hop up, pop up. You really don't need this. I'm going to turn this off. Streamer mode. I wish they had a real streamer mode. This doesn't really benefit anybody, unfortunately. Colorblind mode. This is an interesting one. I get this conversation a lot. I recently started turning it off. For the longest time, I had it on this coloring. As you can tell, it changes the overall colors of armors and so forth, and your ammo. So if you're wearing it, see how it changes it. And your crosshair. So if you have a hard time seeing your crosshair when it's red, obviously you can change the coloring. Turn it to this one. See how now it's white or yellow? It's also pretty important there. I'll turn this off. Subtitles, if you prefer it. I don't. You can turn these on. You can make them large, huge, so forth. Don't really recommend this. Don't recommend this either. I mean, if you need this, 100% utilize it. This is an accessibility thing. So this is something more to benefit you if you struggle in different areas. So definitely utilize it. So this covers everything gameplay. This actually should make a pretty big difference in what you're doing. And hopefully, I haven't seen a whole lot of guides on this. I see tips and tricks here and there, but this is a full-fledged tutorial on settings. And hopefully you find this really, really impactful. Now, my own personal sensitivities. I use 1.52 blah, 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 blah. It's like 13.421 something ridiculous inches per 360. Now, you can change it per optic. Now, when you're looking at my sensitivities, this is actually matching my hip fire. 1.3 matches my hip fire at 1.52. 2.2 matches my hip fire at 1.52. I leave everything else because it starts to scale. Now, this is something important. I might do a scope sensitivity later. I was explaining this, but just to give a very brief overview, and I might dedicate its own video to this because I know this video is already getting a little long, and I appreciate your patience as you're watching, but this is also really important to understand. So when you're looking at your settings, and I don't remember the number offhand, I believe it was 3.2. You know what I'm going to do? I'm going to go to mousesensitivity.com. This is going to get its own separate video, but it's actually important, especially for those, even on controller, this is a benefit outside of mousesensitivity.com. Okay, for the most part, please ignore how complicated this looks. I'm just matching my hip fire to my sensitivity. So I'm going to add this here, do this right here to get it super accurate. And the number for the zoom scale of a 3x is 3.28 approximately. If I put it in game, it's probably going to round to 2.8. Yep. So this is important to showcase of the difference between hip fire and a zoomed in. So you're just going to have to trust me on this because I don't have a hand camera on it right now. So this is my hip fire, right? I'm not changing the movement and what I'm doing. So I'm going to click it and notice how I'm covering less distance because it was going from here to like somewhere right here. So if I'm going back and forth like that, now if I zoom in doing that same movement, look how much is cut short. That's because my inches per 360 has changed, right? Now if I match my hip fire to my 3x, notice how the sensitivity is going to go up, right? So you saw the same speed. Now you're just going to have to trust that my sensitivity is the same. See how much faster it is, but it is occupying and covering the same space. Look at the center of the crosshair. and I go back and forth. Now, my hand movement isn't changing dramatically what I'm doing here, but if I lower my sensitivity, you should notice right off the rip immediately 10 is way too high. See how the sensitivity has lowered. I'll probably do some separate guide on this, but this is just to kind of give you a basic understanding. You could turn this off and just kind of scale it appropriately. I like to have different zooms based off of my sensitivity, and I think you should too as you start to find out what you prefer. Maybe you just prefer the base of just one as it just scales naturally, and that's perfectly okay too. Turn off mouse acceleration. Turn off mouse invert unless you just wanted to invert it. Maybe like maybe like you're flying like a pilot. I'm just gonna leave that in. The fact that I messed that up, that's fine. Lighting effects is off. You have this in certain keyboards like Logitech, but I'm gonna be honest, sometimes it kind of bugs out and it does cause CPU issues. So I honestly recommend turning this off. If you have no issues with it, more power to you. Love it. Loving the vibes. Okay, this is where you obviously can jump. I use a bunny hop. I use scroll mouse wheel down. I use my melee weapon to scroll up. My crouch toggle is Z, and my crouch hold is C. My tactical abilities is Q. My ultimate ability is F. My interact key is, did I say Q, V, F? I might have misspoken there. I apologize. Now, I've been messing. This is going to be its own separate video. Little sneak peek here for Monday, for tomorrow, and I'll talk about this later as I've been messing a little bit with this. I just wanted to get more in depth on this setting and give a lot more insight. Pretty big video in my opinion. I'm pretty excited about it. Melee, these are my weapons. Grenade G. Health item is E after I pull up the window. I don't do this specifically. There's probably others that do. I don't. That's just my personal preference. I have my ping to left alt. My push to talk is on my mouse. I usually am in Discord anyway, so I'm not really using that. And there we have it. For audio settings, just to go over briefly, this changes because keep in mind I'm using a mixer, an amp with my computer, so I honestly control it from there as well. I do push to talk. I usually have music in-game off, especially when I'm streaming. I think that covers everything. I don't use a controller. I'm sorry. If I were to, I'd probably use 3.3 just as a setting. Now, I guess real quick what I can tell you, since I played with a lot of controller players, the higher you go sensitivity-wise, the less you're going to feel the aim assist. That's really all I can say. Other than that, probably turn off vibration. I would leave this to somebody who's a lot more fantastic in terms of, I guess you do get toggle and hold. That's interesting. All right, nonetheless, these are all the settings within Apex Legends. There is nothing I believe that I have not covered. If you believe I missed something throughout this massive tutorial, let me know, and I would be more than happy to go more in-depth about it. I think tomorrow the only thing I'm going to go more in-depth about is hold, aim down sight toggle versus hold. This is a pretty big subject outside of Apex Legends that I'm actually pretty excited to cover. But nonetheless, thank you so much for watching. Be sure to leave a like, subscribe for more content. Hopefully you found this video very, very helpful. You learned a bit. And I will see you guys all next time.